Welcome. This presentation is titled The IEP and How It Relates to Virtual Learning. As more and more students are turning to virtual learning, either through the pandemic or just through the idea that I can learn while I'm not in a brick and mortar school, that developed an issue with how do you write an IEP for those students that are attending virtually. Through this presentation, we hope to answer some of the questions and concerns that you may have when writing an IEP for those students who are attending virtually. Well, we hope to learn. Isn't this going to be fun and exciting? You know, in some ways, the IEP will be written differently for those students who are attending school in a 100% virtual setting. When we think of Avondale, we think of attending virtually at home. It's somewhere other than in front of a teacher in a traditional classroom, receiving instruction and interacting with peers. When we're in a classroom teaching students, we have the ability to redirect them, make sure that they check for understanding, make sure that they're not, clowning around, doing whatever. But in the virtual setting, not so much, because they're on their own, they're at home, they're doing their thing. And we have to write the IEP in such a way that still pertains to those students. So that's what we're hoping to learn. And as we do so, we hope to cover accommodations, modifications, all those things that we would normally write for an IEP for a brick and mortar student. But at the same time, how do we write the IEP for those students that are virtual? What's the difference between remote and virtual learning? I'm always confused by someone that says that they're teaching remotely or they're teaching virtually. And really, when we say a person is learning remotely, it's typically because they're quarantined or there's some short-term reason for why they're learning remotely. Really, when we think of it on the virtual side of things, it's more so that it's long term, but it's the idea that virtual is just that. Learning on the long term, but at the same time, they're getting the information through a computer or through some type of device, maybe their phone, as a way to understand and learn virtually what's going on. At the same time, when we think of remote, it's more like when we think of pre-COVID, where somebody maybe had gotten, a sickness, had, the flu, and was home for 4 or 5 days. They were learning remotely at that time. So hopefully that's a clarification on what we think of as remote versus virtual. And moving forward, that'll be helpful. How virtual instruction compares to in-person instruction. When we think of in-person instruction, it's those students interacting with other students. It's the fact that, you're counting the student tardy after you've already counted them absent, and you're interacting with that student, but they're also interacting with others. It's all those things that when we think of in-person that now is no longer there when we think of virtual. It's a whole different ballgame in the fact that now the student's on their own. Before, they would have asked you for a pencil. But today, now they're having to provide their own pencil. Or the idea that they need a calculator. Well, no, it's on them to get the calculator. So when we think of that idea of virtual versus in-person, that also then coincides with what it is as far as the IEP, and no longer providing them a handheld calculator for an accommodation. So we're going to get into more so those kinds of things, but also the idea that we're not regulating how they learn and in what pace, and whether we're giving them, time at the end of the hour to finish the assignment. All those things is now being determined by the student as they are pacing themselves. So now we get to the why. Why are we doing this? And when we think of it, we think of FAPE, free, appropriate public education for students with disabilities. which is a requirement under Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act of 1973. And when we think of FAPE, it involves the state and federal government, in this case, not making any allowance or any changes for when teachers teach remotely. And in this case, it was brought on by the pandemic. The laws that were in place prior to the pandemic are still in place with the same expectation as it was before the pandemic. So now that students have had a taste of virtual learning, some are choosing to continue with virtual learning rather than returning to a traditional brick and mortar school building. Most likely, there's still some that have chosen to continue to remain as an virtual student, in part because they're afraid of the possible spread of COVID-19, or they're just choosing to go that route because it's maybe easier for them to be able to learn in a more virtual setting as opposed to going to a brick and mortar building. Either way you look at it, FAPE is FAPE. So when we think of FAPE, there's a Supreme Court case entitled Andrew F. versus Douglas County School. And Andrew basically helps us redefine a little bit more of what FAPE is from a previous court case. But in this case, on March the 22nd, 2017, the Supreme Court unanimously rejected the 10th Circuit's standard of merely more than de minimis benefit as one that set the bar too low. So when we think of the Supreme Court, they went on to say that when it's all said and done, a student has to be offered an educational program providing more than just the de minimis progress from year to year. If you think of it that way, and you're only offering the de minimis, then really the Supreme Court said that you haven't offered any education at all. So when we think of de minimis, we have to still offer an IEP to students that sets a challenge, that there's an expectation that the student is still going to achieve progress or that they're going to receive a passing grade. I think in some cases we have doubts that virtual learning will be at all successful for the student, that we maybe have already determined that this is a bad idea, and so the virtual learning thing isn't going to work, and so we don't set the bar all that high. But at the same time, you can't set the bar too high, so we still have to find that happy spot in the middle that says, how are we going to provide an education for the student that's attending virtually, but not be too low, but not be too high? The idea is that we have to meet a substantive obligation under the IDEA is in the fact that a school must offer an IEP reasonably calculated to enable a child to make progress that's appropriate in light of the child's circumstances. Some more of the why. There's so much because of the why, because of where we are today with how we're held accountable for what's in the IEP and for what instruction the student is receiving, whether it be virtually or in person. The Department of Education indicated in March of 2020, during the pandemic, that students with disabilities are not receiving services for whatever reason, in this case the pandemic, that we must figure out what needs to happen to help the student get caught up on an individualized assessment. That there really isn't any student that what I would call, for lack of better terms, as a cookie cutter. We have to be able to figure out and nail down what it is about each student and how it's an individual type thing. And this case here on this particular slide, that's basically what it's referencing, is what is it that we have to do to make things work, whether it be virtual or in person, when it comes to the student receiving an education. In part, that's to document, document, and document. When we think of documentation, really that data is our best friend. And we think of we're documenting things on the PWN and in other places within the IEP that will help ensure that we have covered our bases with how the student is receiving services. For example, question 1 of the PWN, that's that place where really it's pretty important that we indicate what services would be provided at traditional brick and mortar school, and then to also indicate what is being provided for the student while they're attending virtual school. We're trying to lay out what it is within the IEP that we would have traditional as well as virtual. And you're going to see that more so as we go through the presentation on what that looks like and how we try to formulate that in the IEP. Another example of where you could document things could very easily be the case notes page. That's a good place to document and keep track of the communication that takes place between the parent and staff at school, or suggestions that maybe the parent has when it comes to how their student is learning at home or what they may need. So it's really document, 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 and what better place to do that than within the IEP. Finally, the last piece when we think of the why, and it's really kind of a cautionary tale here, and that is that as all students have access to online learning, both in the general education and the special education student, there's always an expectation to the rule that someone will not get access to learning materials that they might be provided online. So the idea that if I'm learning online as a student, if I'm learning online, what is it that is going to be different for me because I'm a special education student? To just say that everybody's treated equally and you watch the video and then you answer the questions, or the idea that we're not providing anything in addition to, really doesn't fit well with how the IEP is supposed to work, or the idea that what the law says. So that idea of the just kind of being on caution, just make sure that you're keeping track of concerns that the student may have and how they might struggle online because of their exceptionality, and what can we do to make that easier or better for the student. Part of it is that instance I mentioned earlier about TCalc and how we are providing a room at TCalc for the student to arrive and have to sit in a desk, or the lights are all on, or there's no TV around, or the idea that we're providing a tutor through Capital City or through Avondale Academy to help the student to understand what's being taught to them through the online virtual process. So just be sure, at the end of the day, just be sure that your building consulting teacher is aware of some issues here that you may be having, and they, along with other district staff, can help figure out what it is to make or to help your student that is attending virtually. The next few slides are going to talk about how we set up the IEP to reflect a virtual and in-person. In part because the thought or the line of thinking is that the student may one day return to a more traditional brick and mortar school to receive instruction. So writing the IEP as if the student is still in a traditional classroom will be key once they come back. And just the thought is maybe we won't have to rewrite the entire IEP. So we get it that virtual learning isn't for everyone, but at the same time, the parent may initiate a change in services and enroll their child in virtual learning. The key is that virtual learning cannot just be watching a video and answering questions. We're going to have to, as the primary implementer, we're going to have to try to make sure that we're providing additional support beyond what other gen ed students would get who are learning virtually. The idea that there could be some things that we could put in play to make that happen over and above what it is that a gen ed student would be getting. We can't just say, okay, here's the video, go for it. So the virtual student that has an IEP needs more assistance than what would be offered otherwise. And then in this case, the hope is that the IEP will be written in such a way that when the student does return to a traditional classroom, that the IEP will essentially already be in force. We'll already have the modifications that would have been in a normal traditional setting, the accommodations. We may not be able to add everything on when we think of minutes and other things in a traditional setting, but if that being the case, hopefully we'll only have to write an amendment to indicate the change in minutes and other things. And when I also think of, I've been saying accommodations, also referring to goals, that we want to make sure that the goals would maybe be there as well. And then that way all that needs to be written is an amendment as opposed to an entire IEP. And the last piece here is on the virtual versus in-person, is the idea that when writing the IEP, that the accommodations and modifications should have every avenue that are available to us. There may not be very many, but we would hope that we can get in some accommodations and modifications that would be helpful for the student. And in this case, we're just going to have to do our best, but at the same time, you may want to refer to your building CT for that help in what those accommodations and modifications would be. Goals. The goals are always a hard one, and I hope that this slide will help when writing the goals. But when we think of the goals, reading, math, and so forth, we want to go ahead and continue to include those as if they were in a traditional classroom. Monitoring that goal might be a challenge, but again, we want those goals to still be there for maybe a couple reasons, really. One being that we want to not forget that from one IEP to the next that they had a goal in reading, but also to that point that I've been making, that we want the goal to be there once they return and we're not having to rewrite an entire IEP and then having another meeting. So the idea that the goals are still there as if they were in a traditional classroom. You may decide that a time management goal or a work completion goal would be appropriate to monitor the progress while the student is attending virtually. Every so often you'll get, or request an update from your building CT or through Avondale on as far as how they're making progress, and you're going to have the availability to see whether or not the student is using their time wisely, or if they're logging on long enough to get work done, or how often they log on. So that's kind of the reasoning behind why you may want to write a time management goal or a work completion goal while they're doing their virtual school. But at the same time, all the goals should include a statement that the instruction or the learning will be addressed in a general education curriculum. Accommodations. In this case, accommodations, as they are in any IEP, are very important. It's preferred that you go ahead and include the accommodations as if they were in a traditional classroom. And you may be able to figure out the accommodations that they may get when they are in virtual. And that's totally cool if you're able to do that. In this case, within the accommodation, you're going to want to include a statement that says this is where the student is receiving this accommodation. And it could be in a brick and mortar school only, or brick and mortar setting only, or in a traditional classroom, or something along those lines that indicates that this is the only setting or only place that they're going to get this accommodation. I'm thinking of extended time. And, when you're doing virtually, you essentially get all the extended time that you need, that you want, because you're setting the pace as a student while you're learning virtually. But when you're in a school setting, brick and mortar, it's more the idea that there's only so many minutes in a class period, and when the class period's over and you're not done with the assignment, that you get an extended time to complete it. That's what I'm thinking is, on this example with extended time, that you would be able to indicate in there that this is where the setting is. All right. Just as an example of what you would do for your accommodations, I've got my Avondale student here, Boo Boo Avondale, that I've created, that is a model student, I'm sure, but as a sample student. I'm going to go down to accommodations, and I've already got a few pulled up here that would be good to have in an IEP when we think of extended time to complete an assignment for any in-class assignment. But the key here is the location, core classes. And I've indicated that this accommodation will be provided when Boo Boo is receiving instruction in a traditional brick and mortar school. So again, because we had decided that unless there's something unusual about your virtual school, extended time isn't anything that's offered something special to a sped student. Special education students getting extended time just the same as a gen ed student. We think of read aloud when requested for assessments. Hey, when Boo Boo is struggling to read the questions on a test, she may ask that the test be read aloud to her, core and elective classes. So in this case, we're going to want to go ahead and include this accommodation is provided, will be provided in a brick and mortar setting, or brick and mortar school might be a better term. So you're just going to have that included, during the duration of the test. The dates are the same. PWN continued. It's gonna be there's I think 3 slides on this particular when we're talking about the PWN. This section, when we think of number 1, description of action, placement, or services proposed or refused, in my mind is the most important section on the PWN. You'll need to go ahead and include the services, accommodations, minutes, anything else, related services that the student was receiving while in a traditional brick and mortar school. You'll want to be sure to include whether or not the parent initiated the change to virtual learning, or was it an IEP team decision? And then lastly, you're going to need to include what it is that the student will be receiving or is receiving doing the virtual or attending the virtual school, learning that way, the accommodations and the related services, etc. The thought is by including both, once the student returns, then you're kind of one step ahead because it's already listed. But also, too, it is, I think, a good reminder to the parent that the student is receiving these services in a traditional setting, and these are the services that they're receiving in a virtual setting. And I think that can be eye-opening to a lot of people. We're back one more time to visit Boo Boo. And in this case, I maybe pull up the PWN. So in this case, we're going to slide down, and this is where we were talking the D and the E. So if there's a substantial change in services, 25% or more, and I had suggested there probably would be, we'd be checking the D and the material change, and then the change in placement. Again, kind of a who initiates it. If it's a parent-initiated change, it may not require a signature, so we would check the first box. If it was a parent-initiated change, if it's an IEP team decision, then it would be more of a substantial change in placement, which would require parental consent. In this section here, we had talked about the fact that in this first section is what did Boo Boo get in a traditional school. So the accommodations, so forth and so on. She got, read aloud and so forth. And then what minutes did she get? It was a C setting, so forth and so on. At the last part, now what is Boo Boo getting in virtual school? And then you would indicate what it is that you had. We had 5 minutes, A setting, more of an indirect, special ed, so forth and so on. The last piece is who initiated the change. Did the parent initiate the change, or did the IEP team initiate the change? If it was initiated by the parent, then I would recommend the change in placement. The change was initiated by Boo Boo and her parents. However that looks. And then the last part is the piece about why is it that Boo Boo is getting virtual services. Again, it was a change in placement. The virtual services. I'm really going kind of quick here. Services. You would maybe do a little better grammar than I'm doing, but the virtual services, that it was initiated by your parents. That kind of thing, as we had in the example. So PWN, again, it needs to be that section section 1 is pretty darn important, section 2 as well, and then you just fill in everything else as you would normally. Explanation of why the action is proposed or refused. In this case, it's the idea that the IEP is written to reflect minutes and services for virtual learning. At the same time, we need to indicate in question 2 whether or not this was a student-parent decision or choice to attend virtually, or was the decision an IEP team initiated change. It's the idea that we just want to make sure that the minutes aren't really reflective of a traditional setting. It's the virtual setting, and at the same time that we are having something in place that's kind of out of the ordinary, which is virtual learning. This is the last slide. Made it to the end almost. We're almost there. So in the anticipated services chart, I think it's going to look differently than what we're accustomed to, in the fact that we are not going to list the minutes that the student would be receiving in a traditional setting. In part because the student isn't receiving minutes that's in a traditional setting. They're receiving minutes that's in a virtual setting. So the actual minutes that they're receiving is what we would want to put on the anticipated services chart. They're going to look like indirect. They're going to be consultation. Essentially what you put on the services page for the remote section is what's repeated in the anticipated services chart. You'll want to make sure that any related services that the student is receiving, those minutes are also listed on the anticipated services chart. It's the idea that we want to just make sure that the anticipated services chart reflects the minutes that the student is actually receiving while attending virtually. And then, as always, you want to duplicate the minutes for the next school year. No one knows when or if the student will return to a virtual set or to a traditional setting. Last but not least, the anticipated services chart. I've already got filled in what Boo Boo's getting, 15 minutes, whatever, one day, every other week, or 5 minutes. Recommendation is, not a lot, so we'll just make it back to 5. The one thing I did not mention, and I am remiss of leaving it out, and that is social work services. If the student was receiving social work services, we'll want to be sure to include those. I would recommend getting with your social worker in your building to figure out what it is that they're providing, however many minutes, how often. In most cases, it's 15 minutes one day every quarter or whatever. So in this case, we'll want to make sure that those minutes are still being offered, social work minutes. But also, too, we've talked about speech language and some other things. We want to make sure that these get included, both on this page as well as on the services page. Last page is the contact for questions. I'm listed on there along with all the building CTs. Kara Sheets is the school psych for the district. She's more than happy to answer any questions that you may have. I would start first with your building CT, and they can reach out to whoever they, related services wise, or whoever they feel needs to be contacted to answer questions. Again, I hope that this was helpful, and this answers some questions when it comes to writing a virtual IEP. And thank you for attending, and have a good day.